The sun bled red over the Arizona canyon, painting the desert in fire. Caleb Holt, a man carved from silence and sorrow, rode slow across his lonesome ranch. His hands gripped the reins, calloused, steady, but his heart hadn't beat right since the flames took his wife and boy. Then a sound, a faint cry, sharp as a knife, cut through the dusk. He froze. There, in the shadow of a jagged mountain ridge, stood Lila Dawn, an Apache woman, her dark eyes wild with fear, her torn dress clinging to her sweat-damp skin. Her chest heaved, breasts straining against the thin fabric as she clutched a bow, arrow nocked, aimed at his heart. "Don't move," she hissed, her voice low, trembling but fierce. Their eyes locked, his steady, hers burning with a mix of defiance and desperation. A bead of sweat traced the curve of her throat, catching the dying light. Caleb's pulse quickened, a forbidden heat stirring in his gut. She was danger, beauty, a secret he couldn't unsee. From the ridge, a shadow moved, riders, their dust rising like a storm. Who was she running from? And why did Caleb, a man who'd sworn off caring, feel his world tilt under her gaze? Could he turn away? Or had she already claimed him? If this tale of the Wild West pulls you in, drop a like, let us know where you're listening from, and hit subscribe for more stories where hearts and guns collide. Lila Dawn lay crumpled beneath the mesquite tree, her body a shadow against the canyon's red glow. Caleb dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and knelt beside her. Her dress, torn at the thigh, revealed a gash, deep, jagged blood seeping into the dust, staining her skin like spilled wine. Her ankle was worse, swollen and bruised, twisted at an angle that made his stomach lurch. She tried to move, her breath hitching, her chest rising and falling, the thin fabric of her blouse straining against her curves with each labored gasp. Pain etched her face, but her eyes, dark, fierce, defiant, locked onto his, daring him to look away. A bead of sweat traced the curve of her neck, pooling where her throat met her chest, glistening in the fading light. Caleb's hands hovered, hesitant, his pulse quickening at the sight of her exposed skin, soft yet marred by violence. "Can't walk," she murmured, voice raw, her lips trembling. He didn't ask twice. His arms slid beneath her, one hand under her knees, the other cradling her back, her warmth pressing against him, her scent, sage and earth, filling his lungs. She stiffened, then softened, her body yielding to his strength, her breath warm against his neck. Carrying her, Caleb felt the weight of her pain, her secrets, and something else, a forbidden pull that made his heart pound harder than the desert sun. Caleb Holt carried Lila Dawn into his weathered cabin. Her body was light, but her secrets weighed like stone. He laid her on the sagging couch, its faded fabric holding the ghosts of a family lost to flames. Hands rough from years of ranch work cleaned her wounds with a gentleness he didn't know he still had. Her ankle was swollen, her breath uneven, and her full lips parted just enough to make his pulse jump. He kept his eyes low, dodging hers, afraid of the heat they might spark. "You don't have to do this," Lila whispered, her voice like sagebrush caught in the wind. Soft, sharp, cutting. Caleb stayed silent. Words felt dangerous. Days crept by, and Lila healed slow, moving through his world like a shadow, with a pulse. She was cautious, respectful, but alive in ways Caleb had forgotten. One dawn she knelt by the creek, skirt hiked up, her hips swaying slightly as she plucked wild herbs, their scent rising with the morning mist. Caleb, watching from the porch, let his coffee go cold. His chest tightened, a longing he couldn't name clawing at him. She cooked with those herbs, filling the cabin with smells of sage and mesquite, and for the first time in years his meals tasted like something other than ash. But questions lingered, heavy as the desert heat. Why was she running? What secret made her eyes scan the horizon? Eli Boone, Caleb's old friend from town, rode up one evening, his face lined with worry. "Folks are whispering, Caleb," he said, his gaze flicking to Lila as she stood by the corral, her dark hair loose, catching the breeze like a wild thing. Her arms flexed as she adjusted a rope, her movements sure, sensual in their strength. "An Apache woman? You're stirring up trouble." Caleb's jaw clenched. "My land, my rules." Eli leaned closer, voice low. "You don't know who's after her, or what she's carrying." Lila overheard, her fingers pausing as she braided her hair, each motion slow, deliberate. She met Caleb's eyes, and something passed between them. Trust, fragile as a thread, but laced with fear. She hadn't told him everything. He hadn't pushed. That night, by the fire's glow, Lila sharpened a small knife, its blade catching the light against her skin, smooth and taut as a drum. Caleb watched, his throat dry, her every move pulling at something deep in his gut. "You don't trust me," she said, eyes on the blade. "I don't trust Easy," he answered, voice rough, worn from years of silence. "But you're here. That's something." She nodded, but her gaze stayed guarded, her lips parting slightly as she exhaled. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken wants. Caleb felt it, a rope tightening around his heart, pulling him toward her. He wanted to unravel her, to know the weight of her secrets, but his own past held him back. He'd lost a wife, a son, a life. Hope was a risk he couldn't afford. Yet, when Lila stood to stoke the fire, her silhouette curving against the flames, her waist narrowing into hips that swayed with quiet grace, he caught himself staring, his hands clenched, fighting the urge to reach for her. Was she a guest, a danger, or the one thing he'd never survive losing? The next day, Caleb found fresh tracks near the north fence. Boots, too heavy for a rancher, too clean for his own. His gut twisted. Someone was watching. He didn't tell Lila, but he oiled his rifle, its cold steel a reminder of a vow he'd made never to kill again. Lila noticed, her eyes narrowing as she carried water from the well, her blouse damp, clinging to her curves. "You saw something," she said, not asking. Caleb nodded, his voice steady, but low. "They're close." She didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened on the bucket, her knuckles pale. For a moment they stood there, the desert stretching wide around them, the silence heavy with what neither dared say. Caleb's heart pounded, not just for the danger, but for her, the woman who'd walked into his world and made it feel alive again. The Arizona nights grew heavier, the air thick with secrets. Caleb Holt felt Lila Dawn's presence in every corner of his ranch, her shadow weaving into his days like a song he couldn't shake. She moved with purpose now, her ankle mending, her steps light but sure. One evening, she stood by the well, drawing water, her blouse damp from the effort. Her hips swayed as she pulled the rope, each motion a quiet challenge to Caleb's restraint. He watched from the barn, his hands gripping a pitchfork, knuckles white, fighting the heat rising in his chest. She glanced over, her dark eyes catching his. Bold, knowing, and for a moment, the world was just them, two souls teetering on a knife's edge. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across Lila's skin as she knelt to grind herbs. Her fingers worked slow, deliberate, the motion pulling her blouse tight, revealing the smooth arc of her waist. Caleb stood by the door, his breath uneven, the air between them charged like a storm waiting to break. "You're staring," she said, voice low, teasing, but her eyes held a dare. He stepped closer, drawn like a moth to flame, his boots heavy on the creaking floor. "Ain't polite to stare," he muttered, but his gaze lingered on her lips, full and parted, glistening in the firelight. She rose, her body brushing close, the heat of her skin radiating through the thin space between them. His hand grazed her arm, calloused fingers catching on her softness, and she didn't pull away. Her breath hitched, her chest rising, the fabric of her dress straining as she leaned in, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her exhale. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Caleb's hand slid to her waist, fingers tracing the curve above her hip, her body yielding under his touch. Her eyes fluttered shut, her lips inches from his, and he felt the pull. Raw, undeniable, a hunger he'd buried since the fire took his world. She tilted her head, her hair spilling over her shoulder, brushing his chest, and his other hand found her neck, thumb grazing the pulse that raced beneath her skin. It was a collision of want and wound, two broken souls daring to mend. His lips hovered near hers, the air electric, their breaths mingling, when a sharp crack split the night, a twig snapping outside, too deliberate for a coyote. Caleb froze, his hand dropping from Lila's waist, the spell shattered. His eyes darted to the window, where moonlight caught the glint of steel. "Stay here," he growled, grabbing his rifle from the wall. Lila's hand caught his wrist, her grip firm, her eyes wide, but not with fear, with resolve. "They're here," she whispered, her voice steady, but her body still trembled from their almost touch. She pulled a small knife from her belt, its blade catching the fire's glow, her stance fierce, her curves outlined in the dim light as she stood ready. Caleb's heart pounded, not just for the danger, but for her, this woman who'd stirred something he thought was dead. He stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, the desert stretching dark and endless. Tracks in the dirt, boots, heavy, fresh, led toward the canyon. Silas Kane's men, he knew it. They'd come for Lila, for whatever she carried, and they wouldn't stop. A shadow moved near the corral, and Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger, but Lila's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Not yet," she murmured, her breath warm against his ear, her body pressed close for a fleeting moment, reigniting the fire in his veins. She pointed to the ridge, where another figure crouched, watching. "They're circling," she said, her voice low, her lips brushing his jaw as she spoke, unintentional, but searing. They ducked back inside, hearts racing, the air still thick with what had almost happened. Lila's eyes met his, fierce but soft, and she handed him the knife, her fingers lingering on his. "We need a plan," she said, her voice steady now, but her chest rose and fell, betraying the heat still simmering between them. Caleb nodded, his mind torn between the danger outside and the ache she had sparked inside him. He'd sworn off killing, sworn off feeling, but Lila had changed that. The tracks meant time was short. Silas Kane was closing in, and whatever Lila carried, be it a relic or a truth, made her worth dying for, or killing for. As they sat by the fire, plotting traps with her Apache cunning and his rancher's grit, Caleb stole glances at her. Her hair fell loose, framing her face, her skin glowing in the firelight, and he knew he was slipping. The danger outside was real, but the danger within, the pull of her, the risk of loving again, was worse. What would he sacrifice to keep her safe? And could he stop himself from falling completely? The desert held its breath, the night sharp with menace. Caleb Holt crouched by the corral, rifle steady, eyes scanning the canyon's edge where shadows moved like wolves. Lila Dawn knelt beside him, her knife glinting, her breath quick. She leaned forward, alert. The air still hummed with the heat of their near kiss, but danger had smothered it. Tracks crisscrossed the ranch, Silas Kane's men, closing in. Caleb's past as a bounty hunter stirred, his hands itching for a fight he'd sworn to leave behind. Lila's eyes, fierce and unyielding, met his. "They want what I carry," she whispered, her voice low, her fingers brushing his arm, sending a jolt through him. She hadn't said what it was, a relic, a map, a truth, but it made her a target. And now, him too. Dawn broke, cold and gray. Taza, Lila's kin from the Apache village, slipped through the brush, his face grim. "Kane's got 8 men," he said, handing Lila a pouch, its contents heavy, secret. Her fingers trembled as she tucked it into her belt, the leather hugging her hips, her movements swift, drawing Caleb's gaze despite the danger. "They'll come at noon," Taza warned, then vanished into the canyon. Lila turned to Caleb, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her curves sharp against the morning light. "I can lead them away," she said, her voice steady but her eyes pleading. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You leave, they'll hunt you forever. This ends here." Her lips parted, a protest forming, but his look silenced her, a look that said he'd die before letting her go. They set traps, her Apache cunning weaving with his rancher's grit. Lila strung tripwires with mesquite thorns, her hands deft, her skirt riding up as she crouched, revealing the smooth line of her thigh. Caleb's pulse quickened, but he focused on rigging snares near. The canyon's mouth. The work bound them, their glances heavy with unspoken promises. By midday the air grew thick, dust rising on the horizon. 8 riders appeared, Silas Kane at the lead, his scarred face twisted with hate. "Halt!" he barked, dismounting, his coat flapping like a vulture's wings. "Hand over the Apache girl and her trinket." Caleb stood firm, rifle raised, Lila at his side, her bow nocked, her stance fierce, her breasts rising with each controlled breath. "She's under my protection," Caleb said, voice cold as steel. "Step off my land." Kane smirked, his men fanning out, hands on pistols. "You know me, Holt? From Abilene. You left me for dead." The words hit like a bullet. Abilene, where Caleb's last bounty hunt ended in blood and regret. Lila's eyes flicked to him, questioning, but she held her ground, her body tense, the curve of her waist sharp against her drawn bow. The first trap sprung. A tripwire snapped, thorns slashing a rider's leg, his scream echoing. Chaos erupted. Caleb fired, dust exploding near Kane's boots, a warning. Lila's arrow flew, pinning a man's hat to a post. But Kane's men were fast, drawing iron, bullets spitting into the dirt. Caleb and Lila dove behind a water trough, her body pressed close, her breath hot against his neck, her scent, sage and sweat, stirring him even now. "We can't hold them," she hissed, her hand gripping his arm, nails digging in. He met her gaze, her eyes burning with fear and fire, and something broke in him. He'd sworn off killing, but for her, he'd break any vow. "Stay low," he growled, then lunged up, firing. A man fell, clutching his shoulder. Lila sprang forward, her knife flashing, cutting a rope that dropped a net of rocks on 2 riders. The canyon roared with shouts and gunfire, but Caleb's world narrowed to her, to keeping her alive. Kane charged, his pistol aimed at Lila. Caleb tackled him, the 2 men crashing into the dust, fists flying. Kane's knife grazed Caleb's arm, blood seeping, but Caleb's rage was stronger. He pinned Kane, fist raised when Lila's voice cut through. "Enough!" She stood over them, bow drawn, her hair wild, her chest heaving, the pouch at her belt gleaming in the sun. "Take it and go," she said, tossing it to Kane. He snatched it, grinning, but his eyes flicked to Caleb. "This ain't over, Holt." He mounted and rode off, his men limping behind, dust swallowing them. Caleb staggered to his feet, blood dripping, heart pounding. Lila's hand found his, her touch soft, but electric, her eyes wet with something deeper than gratitude. "You could have died," she whispered, her voice breaking, her body close, the the heat of her skin pulling at him. He wanted to pull her in, to lose himself in her. But the pouch was gone, and with it, her secret. What had she given up? And what would Cain do with it? The ranch felt quiet, but the danger wasn't gone. Caleb knew it, and so did she. They stood there, hands entwined, the desert watching, waiting for their next move. The Arizona sun sank low, painting the canyon in shades of fire and shadow. Caleb Holt stood on his porch, his arm bandaged, the ache of the fight still pulsing through him. Lila Dawn sat beside him, her dark hair loose, catching the breeze, her blouse soft against her skin, the curve of her shoulder glowing in the twilight. The pouch was gone, given to Silas Cain to end the bloodshed, but its weight lingered in her eyes, guarded, heavy with a truth she hadn't shared. Caleb felt it, the unspoken cost of her sacrifice, but her hand rested in his, warm, steady, anchoring him to something he hadn't known since the flames took his past. They'd fought, bled, and stood together, and now the ranch felt different. Not empty, but alive. Days turned to weeks. Lila stayed, her ankle healed, her presence weaving into the rhythm of the land. She planted desert herbs behind the cabin, her hands deep in the earth, each motion a quiet promise of roots taking hold. Caleb watched, his heart stirring, no longer fighting the pull. She taught him to read the stars, her voice soft as she traced constellations, her fingers brushing his as they pointed to the sky. He showed her how to mend fences, her laughter ringing when she fumbled the wire, her eyes bright, her chest rising with each breath, stirring that same forbidden heat in him. They didn't speak of love, but it lived in the spaces between them, in the way she waited for him on the porch, in the way he carved a small wooden charm for her, a silent vow. Word of their stand against Cain spread, a whisper in the town that grew to a tale. Some folks sneered, their prejudice sharp, but others saw the truth. A cowboy and an Apache woman, two broken souls who'd found each other. Eli Boone brought news. Taza had reached the Apache village, carrying a warning about Cain. The pouch, Lila finally confessed, held a map to sacred land, a secret her people guarded with their lives. She'd let it go to save Caleb, but her eyes held a flicker of hope. "We'll take it back," she said, her voice fierce, her hand squeezing his. Caleb nodded, knowing the fight wasn't over. But for now they had this, their ranch, their peace. One night, under a moon bright as silver, they sat close, her head resting on his shoulder, her warmth seeping into him. The desert stretched wide, its silence no longer heavy but full, like a song. Caleb's fingers traced the charm around her neck, her skin soft under his touch, and he felt it. Redemption, not just for her freedom, but for his soul. He'd lost everything once, but Lila had given him a reason to live again. The horizon glowed, a new road unfolding, and though danger waited, they'd face it together. A single star blinked, bright against the dark, a beacon for what lay ahead. If this tale of love and grit in the Wild West moved you, drop a like, tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe for more stories of hearts forged in fire. A super thanks keeps these tales alive, so we can bring you more from the desert's edge.